Well, 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 my little death enthusiasts. Do I have a killer tale for you tonight? A chilling story of viral terror and twisted science. Meet a field researcher who thought he was just investigating a little outbreak. But oh, how wrong he was. He was looking for answers, but what he found was something far worse. Something that would have even the undead running for cover. So, grab your hazmat suits and your last breath, my fiends. It's a tale of infection, mutation, and a little thing we like to call Patient Zero.
They assured us Patient Zero was nothing more than a tragic relic, a cautionary tale buried under redacted files and charred hospitals. But myths don't leave scars, and they don't scream in the dark. I know because I saw him, and I still hear those screams, clawing at the edges of my sanity. My name is Ethan Graves, and I've spent years chasing truths no one wants to find. Once I was a field researcher, a glorified detective armed with a science degree and too much curiosity for my own good. My mission was deceptively simple: trace the origins of viral outbreaks, stamp out the source, and stop the next pandemic before it began. When the call came, it felt routine. Just another red pin on the map, another town with a tragic headline waiting to happen. This time, it was Ashfield, a tiny, unremarkable dot, hidden deep in the Appalachian Mountains, the kind of place where time forgets people. Overnight, it went dark. No calls, no emails, no movement in or out. A ghost town swallowed by silence. The news shrugged it off, blaming a freak storm that had downed power lines. But the Global Pathogen Defense Unit, the shadowy organization I called home, didn't buy it. Storms don't erase people, and we had seen this kind of quiet before. Small towns don't just vanish, Dr. Langley had said, her voice as clinical as the scalpel scars on her hands. Ashfield is ground zero for something. Find out what. Armed with a hazmat suit, a camera, and just enough false courage to steady my shaking hands, I drove toward Ashfield. The winding roads snaked through mist-drenched pines, the trees looming like silent sentinels. The air grew colder with every mile, clinging to me like a warning I couldn't shake. By the time I reached the town's limits, the silence wasn't just unsettling, it was oppressive. Not a single bird cried out. No wind whispered through the branches. The world held its breath. Then I saw it. The first crack in the facade of normalcy. The Welcome to Ashfield sign stood crooked, as if the earth itself wanted to reject it. Across its surface, a jagged crimson smear cut through the cheerful letters. Below it, a single word had been scratched into the wood, trembling with urgency. Leave. As I stepped over the threshold into Ashfield, the unease thickened, pressing against my chest like an unseen weight. The streets yawned with an unnatural emptiness. Cars sat abandoned in the middle of the road, their doors gaping open as if the drivers had vanished mid-thought. Storefronts stood undisturbed, their displays frozen in a grim parody of normalcy. It wasn't just a ghost town. It felt like the aftermath of something unspeakable, a crime scene with no bodies. I gripped my radio tightly, more for the illusion of connection than necessity. "This is Graves," I said, my voice a whisper against the void. "I'm inside Ashfield. The place it's dead. Nothing, not even the static hum of an open channel to remind me I wasn't entirely severed from the world, just silence. Heavy, deliberate silence. I was alone. That's when I saw it. The first clue. A single woman's shoe lay in the middle of the road, eerily pristine, except for a dark smear on the sole. Blood, maybe. My heart tightened as my eyes darted to the pavement nearby, where deep, jagged scratch marks carved a desperate story into the asphalt. Someone had been dragged. The trail of chaos led to an alley, its gaping entrance shrouded in shadow, like a predator waiting to strike. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to run, but I didn't. I couldn't. I was a scientist, trained to seek answers, to put logic above fear, and yet logic crumbled with every step I took into the darkness. When I reached the alley's end, the air itself seemed to thicken, heavy with something primal and wrong. A hunched figure crouched in the shadows, silhouetted against the dim glow of a flickering streetlight. It moved with a feral, jerking rhythm, its focus locked on something or someone beneath it. Then came the sound. Wet, visceral, inescapable, flesh-tearing, sinew-snapping, the kind of sound that burrows into your bones and refuses to let go. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice cracking against the suffocating silence. The figure froze mid-motion, its head twitching unnaturally before it began to turn, slowly, deliberately. What met my gaze wasn't a face. It was a nightmare carved into flesh. Rotting skin clung in patches to an exposed skull, and hollow, cavernous eyes stared back at me, void of anything remotely human. Blood dripped lazily from a mouth stretched too wide, as if the very act of being alive was tearing it apart. And then it screamed, not a sound, an assault, a jagged, guttural shriek that shattered the air and crawled under my skin, setting every nerve alight. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything I could name. I stumbled back, my breath hitching as panic seized my chest. My heart slammed against my ribs, each beat a deafening echo in the silence. Before I could fully process what I was seeing, the figure lunged. Its movements were all wrong, jerking too fast, like a marionette on tangled strings. Instinct took over. My hands moved faster than my thoughts, snatching the taser from my belt and firing in one fluid motion. The sharp crack of electricity lit up the alley, and the creature's body convulsed violently, limbs flailing in grotesque, unnatural angles. It collapsed into a heap, motionless, but for the faint twitching in its fingers. I wanted to believe it was over, to convince myself I had won, but the way its fingers scraped at the pavement, like they were testing the air, told me otherwise. Backing away from the twitching figure, I fumbled for my satellite phone, my fingers trembling against the buttons. To my surprise, the connection worked on the first try. "Langley, it's Graves," I said, my voice barely steady. "We've got a serious problem. There's something in this town, something not human. I don't know if it's a virus or—" "Get out of there, Ethan," Langley cut in, her voice sharp and trembling, a tone I had never heard from her before. "You shouldn't be there. None of us should." Her fear hit me like a gut punch. "Wait, what? What are you talking about? I thought I was here to stop it." "No," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper, as though someone might overhear. "We didn't send you to stop it. We sent you to confirm." The blood drained from my face. Confirm what? A pause, long enough for me to feel the weight of something far bigger than myself, crushing down. Then in a tone that sounded almost like a confession, she said, "That patient zero is still alive." Langley's words struck me like a punch to the gut, knocking the air from my lungs. Ashfield wasn't just another outbreak, a tragic, isolated case that would fade into a footnote of history. No, her tone, her carefully chosen words, suggested something far worse, something deliberate. Questions hammered at my mind, each more unnerving than the last. Who or what was patient zero? What kind of nightmare had they sent me into, armed with nothing but half-truths and a hazmat suit? My stomach churned as realization crept in. I wasn't just a field researcher anymore. I was bait. I gripped the phone tighter, anger bubbling beneath the fear. Why didn't they tell me the truth? Why send me blind into the lion's den? The thought clawed at me, relentless. Whatever they knew, whatever they were hiding, had turned Ashfield into something far worse than a ghost town. It was a trap. Fear clawed its way up my spine, insistent and relentless, but I forced it down. My job wasn't about running. It was about finding answers, answers that no one else was willing to seek. But as I stared at the twitching, spasming thing on the ground, a cold, undeniable truth sank in. This wasn't just a victim. It was something more, something changing. The jerking movements weren't random. They were deliberate, controlled, as if the creature was testing its new form. Flesh rippled unnaturally beneath its decayed skin. And for a moment, I thought I saw something. Bone, sinew, muscle, knitting itself together. My breath caught in my throat. This thing wasn't dying. It was evolving. A wave of dread crashed over me, threatening to drown my resolve. Whatever came next, I knew one thing with chilling certainty. I wasn't ready for it. I sprinted through the desolate streets, the town's oppressive silence pressing against me like a living thing. My flashlight's erratic beam sliced through the darkness, illuminating fractured windows and crumbling facades that seemed to watch my every move. The encounter with the creature had left me shaken, but Langley's cryptic words kept replaying in my mind. Patient Zero is still alive. I had to know the truth. Every step felt heavier. My urgency tangled with dread. My search brought me to the heart of the nightmare, Ashfield General Hospital. Once a lifeline for the town, its decaying facade now loomed like a monument to despair. The building's skeletal frame was battered by time, its windows hollow eyes, staring into nothingness. The doors hung ajar, swaying gently in the cold wind, the sound barely audible over the thudding of my heartbeat. Something about the hospital felt profoundly wrong. It wasn't just abandoned. It was waiting. The air seemed charged, heavy with anticipation, as though the building itself was holding its breath, daring me to step inside. The smell hit me first, an overwhelming wave of rot and chemicals, mingling in a nauseating stench that clung to the back of my throat. It was the unmistakable scent of death, but layered with something sharper, almost metallic, like decay trying to sterilize itself. My flashlight flickered weakly, the unreliable beam sweeping across walls streaked with dark, dried smears that told stories I didn't want to know. The hospital's interior was a graveyard of chaos. Equipment lay scattered, gurneys frozen mid-hallway like they'd been abandoned in panic. Papers and shattered glass littered the floor, crunching under my hesitant steps. At the far end of the hallway, a faint, unnatural glow seeped out from beneath a door marked isolation ward. The light pulsed, irregular and alive, casting jagged shadows that seemed to shift as I approached. Then I heard it, a faint labored sound, like a creature struggling to breathe through shattered lungs. My hand trembled as I pushed the door open, the hinges groaning as if warning me to stop. The sight inside froze me where I stood. In the center of the room, surrounded by overturned desks and shards of broken equipment, was a man, or what remained of one. His body was wasted away to little more than a husk. His skin stretched thin and cracked like old porcelain, ready to shatter. Veins snaked across his frame, dark and pulsing, as if something beneath the surface was alive. But it was his eyes that paralyzed me. They weren't the eyes of a dying man. They weren't even human. They burned with a terrible intensity, brighter than the room's glow, brighter than life. They burned with something far worse. They burned with purpose. Patient Zero, I whispered, the words barely audible over the pounding of my own heartbeat. His head snapped toward me, with a series of sharp, unnatural jerks, like a marionette pulled by invisible strings. For a moment, our eyes locked, and the intensity of his gaze rooted me in place. Then he spoke, his voice raw and broken, every word dragging across his throat like rusted steel. They said they'd save us, he rasped, his breath rattling with each syllable. But they lied. They made me this. His words hit like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just a monster. It was a man, twisted into something unrecognizable, his humanity reduced to a flicker beneath the grotesque. Before I could respond, he moved. One moment he was hunched in despair. The next he was a blur of motion, faster than anything human. Instinct saved me. I threw myself to the side, crashing into a metal table that screamed against the floor as it skidded beneath my weight. Patient Zero slammed into the wall with a force that cracked the plaster, but the impact didn't slow him. He turned toward me again, his fragile, emaciated frame betraying the monstrous strength that radiated from him. This wasn't a victim of science gone wrong. This was something far worse. Something unleashed. As I scrambled for my taser, Patient Zero froze mid-motion, his body seizing in a violent, unnatural spasm. His back arched impossibly, bones cracking under the strain, and his eyes rolled back, leaving only the sickly white of sclera. Then I saw it, a black, writhing mass beneath his skin, snaking through his veins like living tar. The flesh around it bulged and twisted, as though something inside was trying to claw its way out. "They told me I'd be the cure," he gasped, his voice fractured and alien, shifting between tones like a chorus of overlapping voices. "But I'm just the beginning." My stomach lurched as the truth hit me, heavier than anything I had imagined. Patient Zero wasn't the source. He was the incubator, a grotesque vessel for something far more horrifying. This wasn't just a virus adapting to survive. It was something else, something alive. The realization tightened around my chest, like a vice. The virus wasn't spreading to infect. It was spreading to create. Whatever lived inside him wasn't human, wasn't even viral anymore. It was something new, something that didn't belong in this world, and it wasn't finished yet. Patient Zero collapsed to the ground, his emaciated body convulsing violently as wet, guttural sounds tore from his throat. Then it happened. Black tendrils burst from his mouth and eyes, glistening with a viscous, oily substance that dripped onto the floor. They writhed and twisted unnaturally, like blind serpents tasting the air, their movements deliberate, hungry. I stood rooted in place, every instinct screaming at me to run. But my legs refused to move. My breath hitched as the tendrils paused mid-motion, quivering like they had caught a scent. Then slowly, deliberately, they turned toward me. The air felt thicker, heavier, as though the tendrils were pulling it away. Their movements weren't random. They were searching for me. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs felt rooted to the ground, as if fear itself had chained me in place. The tendrils slithered closer, their movements deliberate, tasting the air with a grotesque sentience. Desperation clawed at the edges of my mind, breaking through the paralysis. I grabbed a broken IV pole from the floor and swung it wildly, the metallic clang echoing in the room as I managed to knock one tendril back. It recoiled, twitching, but the others surged forward, more determined than before. "Langley!" I yelled into my satellite phone, my voice cracking with panic. "You sent me into this hellhole without a warning. What the hell am I supposed to do now?" Her voice crackled through the static, tense and unsteady. "Ethan, listen to me. The virus is adaptive. It feeds off aggression. You can't fight it. You'll only make it stronger. The only way out is containment." She paused, and I could hear her hesitation before she continued. "There's a failsafe in the hospital's basement, a thermal purge system. If you can trigger it, you can destroy everything in the building." "Everything?" I shouted, my voice raw as I dodged another tendril. It smashed into the wall beside me, leaving a black, viscous stain that hissed and bubbled as it spread. "You mean everyone, don't you?" My gaze flicked to Patient Zero, still convulsing on the floor, the tendrils growing longer, more aggressive. Langley's silence was answer enough. My stomach churned. The tendrils lashed out again, faster this time, forcing me to stumble back. I barely kept my footing. "And if I don't, you won't make it out alive," Langley said, her voice barely a whisper now, and neither will anyone else. The weight of her words hit like a freight train. It wasn't just about me anymore. The tendrils were already adapting, their movements sharper, quicker. If I didn't act, this thing would spread far beyond Ashfield, beyond anything we could contain. I took a shaky breath, tightening my grip on the IV pole. Fine, but you'd better hope this works. I bolted for the door, my heart hammering as Patient Zero's inhuman screeches tore through the air, echoing off the ruined walls. The tendrils lashed out, ripping through equipment and splintering plaster like whips of living shadow. I ducked low, my legs churning as I stumbled past them, the tips grazing my back with a searing cold that sent shivers up my spine. Somehow, I made it into the hallway, breath ragged and chest burning. Every step felt like a gamble, the building groaning and trembling under the weight of whatever monstrosity was growing within it. The walls pulsed, cracks spidering across their surfaces as black veins spread like invasive roots. I reached the basement stairs and nearly lost my footing, tumbling forward in my desperate haste. The metallic clang of my shoes on the steps reverberated around me, each sound a countdown to catastrophe. At the bottom, bathed in the flickering red glow of emergency lights, stood the control panel. It looked impossibly far away, but I pushed forward, my legs screaming in protest. Almost there, I muttered through gritted teeth, every syllable a plea as much as a promise. My fingers stretched out toward the panel, so close I could feel the cool metal. Then the roar came. The sound was deafening, primal, and wrong. I froze, my stomach knotting as I turned. Patient Zero, or what he had become, was there, emerging from the shadows. His body had twisted into a grotesque amalgamation of flesh, and the writhing black tendrils fused together in a horrifying union. His form pulsed with a sinister glow, veins of light running through the tendrils like molten lava. His mouth, stretched wide beyond the limits of human anatomy, emitted a guttural snarl that shook the room. Adrenaline surged through me. Without thinking, I slammed my hand down on the purge activation button. The panel beeped in acknowledgement, its light turning from red to white. "This ends now," I shouted, my voice trembling but resolute. The room vibrated as the system roared to life. Alarms blared, lights strobed, and the temperature spiked. Patient Zero lunged toward me, his tendrils whipping out in a frenzy. But I stood firm, watching as the purge began to consume everything. The lights flickered, then blazed to a blinding white, illuminating every shadow and corner of the room. The thermal purge system roared to life, its deep hum vibrating through the walls as searing heat poured into the air. I staggered back, shielding my face from the rising temperature. Patient Zero screamed, a sound that was neither fully human nor entirely monstrous. It was a guttural cry of agony and rage, reverberating with a depth that seemed to shake the building itself. The tendrils thrashed wildly, retreating and withering as the heat intensified, their oily sheen bubbling and evaporating in the fiery onslaught. And then, the unexpected, through the wall of flames and chaos, Patient Zero's eyes found mine. For a fleeting moment, their burning intensity softened, a flicker of humanity breaking through the horror. The twisted snarl that had defined his face gave way to something unthinkable, a faint, almost serene smile. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice fragile, yet resolute, carrying both gratitude and relief. The words hung in the air, cutting through the roar of the flames like a dagger to my chest. Before I could even process what I'd heard, the fire consumed him entirely. His form disintegrated into the inferno, tendrils and flesh reduced to ash, leaving nothing but the unbearable heat and the memory of that final haunting smile. I barely made it out, stumbling through the smoke and collapsing onto the cold ground just outside the hospital. Behind me, the building was consumed by a fiery inferno, its windows glowing like the eyes of some vengeful beast. The flames roared, devouring everything within, reducing Ashfield and its nightmare to ash. But no fire could burn away the truth that clung to me like the stench of smoke. Langley's voice crackled through the phone still clutched in my trembling hand. "It's over, Ethan. You did it." Her words should have been a balm, a moment of relief, but her tone betrayed her, the hesitation curling around each syllable, like smoke curling through the air. I turned my gaze to the horizon, where the first rays of dawn pierced the darkness, breaking through the swirling haze of ash and ember. The light should have felt hopeful. It didn't. "No," I said quietly, my voice hoarse and brittle. "This is just the beginning." I clenched my fists, the weight of the realization pressing down on me like the smoldering air. The virus wasn't destroyed. I could feel it, lingering on the edges of my mind like a shadow that refused to fade. It had already evolved, already spread. Patient Zero was gone, but his purpose, his terrible design, remained. And one question loomed larger than the rest, colder and more terrifying than the flames that still danced behind me. How many others had there been before him?
Well, my dearies, wasn't that a sizzling little number? Nothing like the smell of burning flesh and broken promises in the morning. So, if you liked what you saw, if your heart raced, your stomach turned, and you're still checking under the bed for Patient Zero's long, tasty tendrils, then don't be shy. Like, subscribe, and comment below. I'd love to know what you think. Remember, if you want more twisted tales like this, you know where to find me. After all, I'm just a click away, and you wouldn't want to miss a thing, now would you?